The African-American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, literature, and religion. We'll explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they'd been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and with us today is Claude Johnson, who's the CEO and founder of Black Fives Incorporated. Glad to have you with us today, Claude.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brown.
Now, what is Black Fives? How did you start it, and why did you start it?
Black Fives refers to ancient, if you will, vintage African-American basketball. They were known as fives in the old days for the 5 starting players, and they were known often as Black Fives. And so when I started this effort, it was Black Fives that was the name that sprung out as a natural way to express this history, the heritage, the descendants, the pioneers of that time. So Black Fives Foundation is what we're doing.
By the way,
today.
Just checking on your basketball, when was basketball invented, and who invented it, and where was it invented?
Well, it was invented in 1891 by a guy named Dr. James Naismith at what is now Springfield College, your alma mater, but what was then called the YMCA Training School. And there's a linkage there because, as you know, that's also where the Basketball Hall of Fame is today.
Well, you know, I went to Springfield College, and I actually played basketball in the gym that Naismith helped to build.
Wow.
They had a running track around it. You couldn't shoot from the corners because the track was so low.
That's right.
He put a couple of peach baskets up there to give the players something to do between football season and baseball season.
That's right.
And that's where basketball started, and that's why Springfield College is the home of basketball, and the National Basketball Hall of Fame is in Springfield, Massachusetts.
That's right. And here's a trivia point, which is that why is the basket 10 feet off the floor? And the answer is at Springfield College, which is that when Dr. James Naismith nailed up that peach basket, he nailed it to the running track.
That's the track I'm talking about.
That's right. And that track is 10 feet off the floor.
That's right.
So it's an architectural thing, not necessarily a physical thing.
Now, the interesting thing is 1891. Now, you talked about teams that played in the early 1900s.
That's right.
Where did they play and why did they play?
Well, between 1891 and 1904, there really weren't many African Americans in basketball, but around 1904, a gentleman named Edwin Bancroft Henderson, visited Harvard University to go to a summer training school where he learned basketball. He was a gym teacher in the segregated public schools of Washington, D.C., and when he learned the sport, he realized there's something to this, and he brought the game back to D.C., and he's credited with being the first to introduce the game on a wide-scale organized basis to African Americans, and that was in 1904. So he's considered the grandfather of black basketball.
Yeah, I went to high school and public school in Washington, D.C., and Dr. E.B. Henderson was the head of physical education for the black schools. I knew him, and he knew my father was in Roosevelt's Black Cabinet, and I knew a lot about the history. Now, one thing that many people don't know, the YMCA, which was called the International YMCA College, where it's now Springfield College, had a lot to do with black basketball.
Yes.
The 12th Street Y, the Harlem Y, the Butler Street Y in Atlanta. So tell us a little about that.
Well, what happened is that at the very beginning, there were very few places where blacks could play basketball or do anything in terms of physical fitness. And slowly, especially in New York City, a couple of African American athletic clubs sprung up, like the Alpha Physical Culture Club. And this was because blacks had a higher proportion of deaths and mortality from pneumonia, tuberculosis, because of the close living quarters in the urban centers, especially New York and Chicago, but especially New York. And so when Dr. Henderson saw this, he brought the game to Washington, and one of the first places that he went was the 12th Street Colored
Y, where I learned to play basketball.
District, right, which is still there. It's a National Historic Landmark. But prior to 1910, when there weren't these places to play, right around 1910, something happened, and it was a shift because the radio and the phonograph became commercially available. And because of that, black music was suddenly able to become popularized, ragtime, jazz, and blues. And because of that, a dance craze ensued. And because of that, a ballroom construction craze ensued. And because of these new ballrooms, suddenly blacks had a chance to play because enterprising African-American basketball promoters would say, hey, we want a place to play, and the bands that are now in demand need a place to perform. And because of the influx of African American migrants and immigrants from the South, which needed to have this assimilation in cities, it all came together. So these early games are all advertised as basketball game and dance. And so this is an innovation, this is an African American innovation which made those events meaningful in terms of socially meaningful events. And then out of that came interest from a guy named Julius Rosenwald, who was the CEO of Sears and Roebuck. And he decided right around that time there aren't enough black YMCAs. So he created a matching fund program where if the black communities would raise enough funds, he would match them. And that's how the 12th Street Y, the Wabash Avenue YMCA in Chicago, Butler Street
in Atlanta.
Even New York City, had theirs, eventually 135th Street, that YMCA, and others. That's how they were formed, and that's how part of the reason why basketball flourished in the 1910s.
Now, let me ask this, because this is a history that I actually lived. I lived in many of these things you're talking about. How did you get interested in this?
Well, I was working at NBA Properties as a director of licensing, international licensing. And in that job, part of what we did is we created a program to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the NBA in 1996. I was always interested in history, and so I decided to look at the book that they created to celebrate it, which was called the NBA Encyclopedia of Basketball. It's an 800-page book. Meanwhile, I picked up another great book by a man that you know, Arthur Ashe, who had just published A Hard Road to Glory. It's the history of African Americans in sports, and it goes from the 1600s all the way into the 1900s. And on page 2 of the section on basketball, I read about this team called the Smart Set Athletic Club of Brooklyn, as well as a number of other teams, the St. Christopher Club, the Lowendi Club, the New York Wrens, the Renaissance. And I was wondering why in this 800-page book, there were only 3 pages about earlier teams, and it was about the Wrens and the Globetrotters. So I began a journey of research, exploration. The Hall of Fame didn't know anything. The historian at the league didn't know anything. The Library of Congress didn't know anything. And I realized you have to go to the microfilm to find out what the newspapers said. And so I started spending a lot of time at the Schomburg.
What newspapers were you looking at?
I was looking at the New York Age, the Defender.
Which was a black paper.
These were the old black, what they call the Negro Press, which went back to the turn of the century and even before. And they're all on microfilm in these great institutions that we have, but they sometimes don't know their own treasures. So I began spending all my weekends and vacation days and evenings. I give a lot of credit to places like the Schomburg, but also the Library of Congress and other places, including the library and the archives at Springfield College.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, the Renaissance, probably the most famous of the all-black teams, who won the World Championship in 1939. Bob Douglas founded them, I think, 1926 or 22, something like that.
23.
And they would have dances and they'd play.
Yes.
And if you read about some of those games, they were very competitive. They played a white team mainly, the Philadelphia Spars, the South Philadelphia Hebrew Association, the original Celtics, because basketball, even today, revolves on ethnics. We have Russian basketball, we have Chinese basketball, and at that time we had mainly Jewish groups, Irish groups, Polish groups, and the teams were ethnic and they played in different communities.
That's right.
The world could learn a lot about getting along from that picture. However, when the Renaissance went on the road in the Midwest, they many times have to sleep in their cars because they would not be served, they couldn't stay in a hotel. How far do you think we've come in race relations since those days?
Well, quite far. I mean, if you look at the photos of those teams and the faces of those players, I mean, we see ourselves, of course. The faces in many ways haven't changed. The rules have changed, the game has changed, and society has changed. But one of the things that people don't realize is that black teams were playing against white teams even before 1910. So they were well ahead of baseball in terms of just that camaraderie. And something else happened, and there was a gentleman in Pittsburgh named Cumberland Posey, who was affiliated with the Low-Endi Social and Literary Club, which sponsored a basketball team. His father helped found that organization. And what they did is he discovered that by playing the local all-white coffee club, is the name of the team, is a Jewish team, but in those days people didn't necessarily make a distinction, so it was the black team against the white team. And they shook hands and they created a series that was very popular in the days of racial hysteria, where they leveraged that popularity to benefit everyone. And that model is the same model that eventually Robert Douglas used by shaking hands, making an agreement, and playing against the original Celtics, the Svas, the Cleveland Rosenblums, and all the other teams, because when they went around to the Midwest and to Wisconsin or Indiana, they would advertise themselves in advance, and people wanted to see that so-called colored team. So even though the town and the townspeople made money, they also, as you pointed out, weren't necessarily allowed to sleep in the hotel, so they had a team bus. They typically had a network of African-American friends and family and relatives where everyone was assigned a place to stay. But that didn't make it necessarily easier, and there still was an indignancy that had to go along with that.
Well, the beauty of looking at history is to know how far we've gone. Also, it tells us how far we have yet to go.
Yes.
Many of the attitudes that you reflected in terms of the way blacks were received in basketball still occur. Even though we have millionaires and the greatest players are black and so on, there's still some resistance to this so-called black game. How do you think we'll get past that?
Well, first by understanding what happened. So we had a segregated game, and so when you leave a portion of the population out of the mainstream, then they develop their own style. Either way. So this style had to do with motion and action and the entertaining aspect of it as much as it was competitive. And one has to also recall that in the 1930s, for example, during the height of the Depression, if you were the Wrens and you went out to Wisconsin, or on the way you stopped in Ohio, then if you played a game and the local townspeople were betting on their local team, if you won by too much, you might not get invited back on your rebound, on your return, right? So they had to find a way to stall, to pass the ball without getting trapped, to move the ball around constantly without necessarily scoring. And that innovation, that part of the game, is what created that action.
And then to the Globetrotters, where they made, the trash basket and throwing the ball and so on.
So Abe Saperstein just took that one step further into the entertainment of it. But when the game became integrated, in other words, in 1950, then all of a sudden, the black players had their own style, and at first there might have been some resistance to it, and even today there might be some resistance to it. But there's enough white players and Jewish players and Asian players and Italians and South Americans and Europeans. It's a beautiful game. The game is bigger than any of these different factions and groups. And what I love about this history is that it tells us, it tells African Americans, we were there at the beginning. So we were on the Mayflower of basketball, if you will. And because of that, we also have a responsibility for the stewardship, because it's ours as much as anybody else's.
One of the things that comes up when we think about this is the role of sports generally in society. The black community, I saw the list of the top black millionaires, Tiger Woods, Michael Jordan, Oprah Winfrey, Robert Johnson, Ken Chenault. Practically all of them are related to entertainment in some way. And because entertainment cuts to the soul of people, to their culture, their feelings, it begins to break some of those barriers. I have a story that was told to me about the integration of the University of Alabama football team in 1971, where the civil rights, of course, were pushing them to take a black athlete. So the first one they took with the legendary Barry Bryant was Wilbur Jackson, who was our running back. And the first play in the practice, he ran 20 yards. The next play, he ran 30 yards. The next play, he scored a touchdown. And Paul Bryant, his reputed, have said, the faster that boy runs, the whiter he gets.
Exactly.
And that's a prototypic story of breaking those barriers. It's almost like the Tuskegee Games, which I was one, showing that African Americans can do anything as well or better than anybody else, or as well as anybody else. But that's one of the things that comes about. Now, the question that I'm interested in, how do you get this across to the youth? That's the key question.
Well, you know, we have a foundation that we just created called the Black Fives Foundation, and we use this history to teach life lessons to youth primarily, and also to honor and advocate for the pioneers and their descendants. And so, for example, at the Barclays Center recently, which is the home of the NBA Brooklyn Nets, we did a clinic. And this clinic, we invited some local elementary school students, and I talked about the old equipment and the ball, how it had laces, and the old shoes and the knee pads. But we also talked about the old rules. And in the old rules, one rule that was very important was that you couldn't dribble. You couldn't shoot the ball if you had already dribbled.
Yeah.
So this was pre-1915. And so C.J. Watson, who's a great dude, who's a shooting guard with the Nets, and I did this clinic where we taught these kids what it was like. And what's interesting is, if you're used to all that dribbling and fancy isolation and one-on-one, and now you go to the hoop, but wait a minute, you have to still dish the ball off. If you didn't, it's a turnover. And so that teaches adaptability, it teaches coachability and teamwork. And so even just having those, we have some vintage images that the Barclays Center put up recently in their arena, and you see people walking by, and they're looking and they're saying, wow. And so our whole mission has always been, how do you make this history relevant? And the way to make it relevant is to bring it into the modern era in some way that matters. If it's in an arena where NBA teams play, then it matters all of a sudden. If somebody makes merchandise that's being sold in these venues, or where these logos are on merchandise that's popular, suddenly it matters. And then it gives you an opportunity to talk to those kids and say, well, why does this team matter? What's so important about this history? What can we learn from it? And that's what I love about what we're doing.
Now, one of the things I'm particularly interested in is transferring the lessons of sport into the academic world, because many of our young people are hooked on sports and entertainment and rap, but the fact is that doesn't help you to make a computer, that doesn't help you to make an iPhone, that doesn't help you do heart surgery. So how do you see some of these concepts transferring into the academic world?
Well, one thing we're doing, at least, is we're creating educational curriculum. And so we're going to take this history, which is beautiful in and of itself. The images are beautiful in and of themselves, but also the lessons that one can learn. For example, these pioneers, they had tremendous obstacles, roadblocks, barriers, difficulties, but somehow, without a roadmap, without recipes, without guidance, they found a way to either work with what existed, or get around it, or overcome it. And whatever the essence of that success was, why can't we translate that to today and say, look, we have obstacles and challenges and issues all around, but surely if they did it, we can do it in some way, somehow. The times are different, the challenges are different, but the essence may be the same.
Well, one of the things we have to deal with is what's called stereotype theory. The stereotypes that blacks are good at singing, they're dancing and jumping and throwing. We need to develop a concept that blacks are good at science, technology, business, lawyering. For example, we just see that the bankruptcy attorney for Detroit is an African American.
Yes.
And those are the kind of role models and images that we have to have. But the other thing that I talk about, people say, well, what is the model for success? I said it's in 4 letters, W-O-R-K.
Yeah.
Now that's what we're talking about.
Ralph Waldo Emerson said, the harder I work, the luckier I get.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, that certainly holds true. And it also holds true just to be open to what life puts in front of you. Many of us who have gotten wherever we got, you didn't know you were going to get there. You just follow and you do your best and you stay true to putting all your effort into this moment, into each moment. And then the road unfolds in front of you. You got to keep putting all the hard work and attention, dedication, routines, preparation into it, whether it's a test, a quiz, a free throw, and it all comes down to this. And people don't realize, you know, and our motto for the foundation is make history now. Everybody wants to make history.
That's right.
But the way to make history is to do something right this second, right now, this moment.
Yeah, an obstacle is an opportunity.
That's right.
If you see an obstacle and you approach it that way. Now, one of the problems with the stereotype theory, some of the people who teach our young people do not extend the barriers for them. They can't do it. It's too complicated.
Yes.
It's not too complicated. It's shown in the Tuskegee Gammon, shown with the Black Five, shown in the Jackie Robinson and so on. But that's a message that needs to get over. How much do you do in your program of having people write about this?
Well, that's part of it is writing. We have had essay contests and so on, but a lot of it is also exposure. I always advocate, because I'm so close to the sports industry, I advocate that we look at the sports industry, because everybody, from the makeup artist to the person turning on the lights to the executive producer to all the people behind the scenes at any show or any production on the field, in the arena, there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs potentially in sports. And they're not always the ones that are the limelight, the famous, right? So there's licensing, there's law, there's being an agent, there's also being a player, of course. And so that's just part one. But when you start looking at the marketing and the things behind the scenes, then it opens up all these other opportunities. And so I say, look, if you can get into sports, great. If you can get into entertainment, wonderful. But realize that for every one person that's in front of the camera or on the field, there are hundreds of others behind them. So we look at the success rate and we say there's about 80% African Americans in basketball in the NBA. But only, just to use an example, maybe 30% of all the trainers are African American. And we can go extend that even further into the front office and so on. And there's valid, legitimate, genuine, sincere efforts to change that. I think that should be changed not because it's necessarily even the right thing to do. It is the right thing to do, but also it's just good for everyone. It's good because the world as a reality is that way.
And now the NBA has 32 teams all over the country, and they're going to be all over the world. To what extent have they collaborated or cooperated with you in getting this message across? For example, we're talking about behind the scenes, they would have a program where they invite in school kids to their arenas to see what happened behind the scenes, and not just one class, but dozens of classes. To what extent have you been able to push them to that point yet?
Well, you know, first, I mean, I wouldn't, let's just put it this way. You know, I worked at the league. I was in the properties division, and just recently I met with David Stern. We saw each other at this organization called Beyond Sport, which is how sports groups and other organizations use the leverage of sports to make a difference socially in social causes, whatever they are. And one of the things that's great is that the Brooklyn Nets, with their vision, decided as a way to bring the community in to install 6 mural-sized, life-size images of that Smart Set Athletic Club team and other pioneers like Dolly King, who you knew, and we invited the descendants of the individuals depicted in those photographs to the event of the unveiling, and even to the Jay-Z concert, which was the grand opening for the event. So we had over 40 descendants of that team. I think that this could be done around the country, at least in the NBA cities where those original Black Fives played. And also, I think there's an opportunity for licensing. I think that because we are so close to the logos and they're so beautiful and the history is so beautiful, and because there's an opportunity, and now with this foundation, you know, whenever we do a licensing agreement, 100% of the royalties go to the foundation. And I don't know how many organizations can say that,
Yeah.
but it's something that I'm proud of. And if the league wanted to become part of that, we've had meetings with them. I think that sometimes the timing just has to be right. Sometimes you have to wait till the timing is right. And maybe the timing will be right soon.
Okay, as we come to the close of the program, I want to ask you a question I frequently ask people in sports. Who is the greatest African-American basketball player of all time, other than Michael Jordan?
Well,
Talk about your era.
my top of the
pre-1950.
list is a guy named Clarence Fats Jenkins.
Mhm.
Fats Jenkins was the captain of the New York Rens for 25 years. He played basketball in 4 different decades. And he was seen as the #1 top player during that period.
But
Not
Bob
only
Gates actually got into the Hall of Fame.
well, you know, I'm mentioning Fats because he's not in the Hall of Fame yet.
Okay.
Now, I
very
could
good.
mention Bob Gates, and there's others, and we advocate for them. We have a list of deserving candidates for the Hall of Fame.
Today on African American Legends, we've been talking with Claude Johnson, the founder of Black Fives Incorporated, about the history and legacy of African Americans in basketball. Glad to have you with us today, Claude.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.